Welcome to the Times of Israel's Lazar Focus. That's right. We tweaked the name of the Friday Focus to reflect its star, diplomatic correspondent Lazar Berman. So I'm Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan. And Lazar, how does it feel to have a podcast series named after you?
Oh, it feels incredible. And I'm just wondering, maybe on the daily briefing, we should name it after you. I just haven't come up with a clever pun yet.
The Borschel-Dan briefing?
That works. Nice alliteration there.
It doesn't really. It really doesn't. So I just want to mention to our listeners that it wasn't actually Lazar that came up with this idea. It was by popular demand. And I received several emails and comments on YouTube asking us to change the name of the Friday Focus to the Lazar Focus. So here we are. Now, Lazar, if you remember last week, you and I had a really great conversation with urban warfare expert John Spencer. And listeners, if you missed it, just please check it out. It was well worth it. And when we were speaking, or actually more when you and John were speaking, the term nation building kept being brought up over and over and over. So today in our Lazar Focus, I would like to explore this concept of nation building with you after the break. And we're back. I am Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Lazar Berman, our diplomatic correspondent. So Lazar, let's start by defining a term. Nation building. How is this used on the diplomatic stage?
Sure. So that is also comparable or interchangeable with state building. And, in the past, it's had different meanings. But really, since the Iraq-Afghanistan era after the 9/11 attacks, it really means a use of armed force after a conflict to start a transition to a different type of governance that is going to be more peaceful, probably more receptive and responsive to the needs of its people, and perhaps a democracy. So that's really what sums it up. So it comes after a conflict. You have the military that plays a very central role, and you are helping the host nation, if you want to call it, or the defeated nation, to build something better. And usually it comes from this idea that if the will of the people was expressed, they wouldn't be a threat and they wouldn't want to go to war, because the assumption is, the belief is, you can call me naive, but there are many people who would argue that what people want is jobs, safety, employment, education, women's rights, and they don't want to start making war and supporting terrorist groups. So that's really the logic behind it.
So would you say, for example, after World War II, what was done in Japan and what was done in Germany was, in a sense, nation building?
Oh, absolutely. They're not the only examples. And certainly the U.S. did this even before World War II. But those are kind of the two successful examples, because you had these two societies that were autocratic in every way. You had these dictators, and you had these very martial, very warlike societies that invaded their neighbors, committed horrible war crimes and genocides. And within the space of a couple of decades, these countries look totally different. They're not only aligned with the U.S. and with the West, but they are functioning democracies. And today, of course, Japan and Germany are some of the most successful democracies in the world. And there's really no fear that they're going to slide back into some sort of military dictatorship or anything that even looks like World War II. So that is the example of when this really works well.
Okay. And so in our lifetimes, it seems like we've had a couple examples that didn't work as well. And I'm thinking of Iraq and Afghanistan. But before we turn to that, I just want to learn a little bit more about the actual building blocks of nation building. You talked about military, you talked about expressing the will of the people, often through a democratic new government. But what exactly is needed in this case?
That's a great question. So certainly, especially at the early phases of nation building, you want to have security. You have to provide security for the people, which means it's going to be very heavily militarily focused. Part of that is going to be training local security forces to slowly take over from yourself. And that means the goal is over the course of time, you withdraw your own military to an advisory role and then even a full withdrawal. So that certainly comes first. What you have to do almost simultaneously is start asking yourself who is going to govern this territory. If you've gone to war to defeat and depose, either a terrorist group that is running territory or some sort of dictatorship that threatened you or attacked you, then you need to actually administer that territory for an extended period of time. And usually the initial governance is done by the victor. So it's not by a local country. It's either an alliance, a coalition, but it's run by the victor. That is designed only to give some sort of space to start creating the elements of a move to democracy. So usually it'll be some sort of transitional domestic or indigenous government that will create a constitution, which oftentimes will look very similar to Western or American constitution, and will kind of set the laws in place and also start to change the culture, because often there's, the culture of politics is usually often decided by violence in these places. And we'll start to set the stage for actually having elections for the first time, which elects a constitutional and no longer interim government. And usually there's a lot of focus on that first election, because that means that, at least the idea is that means that there has been a successful transition to democracy. And now the fights that in the past often led to sectarian or religious violence will be decided at the ballot box and in parliament. And that's kind of the vision. So those are important things as well. Longer term, you're also looking at education. So getting, let's say, women into schools is often one that is a priority. Giving people an incentive to go to work and not go to these terrorist groups. So oftentimes it's, getting rid of the terrorist leaders or the leaders of the hostile government, but the masses and the foot soldiers, you want to make sure that they are getting paid so they don't start, grab their gun and just go to some other group that has happened in the past as well. So certainly the economic development is one as well. So I think those are the key elements of the nation building project. Each one of those takes time. Each one of those is complex, and nothing at all is guaranteed.
One of the things that John Spencer said last week that really jumped out at me is when we were talking about, the models of Germany and Japan and Kosovo and things of that nature, which had stabilization forces. He mentioned that Germany and Japan still have these forces. I assume he was referring to U.S. forces in the countries all these years after World War II.
Yeah, absolutely. Not only there was, there was also, if you go back to the Yugoslavian civil wars that broke out there, you had NATO and all sorts of other forces in there as well for many years, including in Kosovo. So, but in Germany and Japan, indeed, there's American forces in both of those. In Germany, it's not to maintain, to make sure that the Nazis don't come back. Very quickly in Germany, it became part of the Cold War. That it was on the front line of the Cold War, West and East Germany. So there was U.S. troops, there was British troops, but those troops remain. But that is part of the NATO effort to keep an eye and to deter Russia. So it's no longer trying to maintain order or to make sure that rogue elements don't take over. That's not something that Germany needs anymore and hasn't in a while.
In Japan?
In Japan, there wasn't a Cold War, and it wasn't clear exactly what the enemy would be. So it was certainly more of a making sure that what America wanted to happen would be imposed. It was took more effort there. But nowadays, and it's been this way for many years now, is the China threat. And U.S. troops in Japan, since Japan has been limited in its military, it's been part of the alliance structure that the U.S. backbones against China. So, it's countries like South Korea, the Philippines, and other countries that kind of ring the islands around China. That's part of the deterrent against China nowadays.
So essentially, it sounds to me, Lazar, that at least in these two models that we talked about, Japan and Germany, at first they needed to be rehabilitated, and then they very quickly or pretty quickly became allies of the imposing power, which in this case is the United States. So let's move on and talk about two other models. As I mentioned, during our lifetime, I'm a bit older than you, but during our lifetime, the US and Britain and other forces have been in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan, I think, is a bit of a different animal to Iraq. So let's talk about the differences between these two situations. What do you want to start with, Lazar?
Sure, we can start with the first one, which is Afghanistan. Again, this was 2001. Al-Qaeda attacks the U.S., and Afghanistan was involved because the Taliban government was hosting Al-Qaeda's organization. And it was very quickly after the September 11th attacks, but the first invasion that George W. Bush ordered was Afghanistan. The conventional war was very, very quick. There was the Northern Alliance that the U.S. allied with that swept down through the country, and it was very, very easy, relatively, to assert control, at least in Kabul and then in some of the other major cities as well. So that initially was a very clean and successful war in the conventional part. Then the question was, okay, what do we do with this country? It's a very big country. It's always had a very weak central government. Other countries have tried to impose their control on it. The Soviets tried. They also had their own nation building project in the Soviet style. Obviously did not work. And tribal groups and tribal leaders are quite dominant there. And that's really where most of the governance comes from. So dealing with that issue, plus the problem of very porous borders, especially with Pakistan. So you're at the same time trying to deal with Al-Qaeda and with the Taliban, and you're trying to build some sort of new government, which is very different than what the Taliban had, right? So you want to, like I said, get women into school. You want to deal with things like the opium trade, which remains a very lucrative trade for farmers. And what do you do with that? You can't just take away their livelihood, and you have to start creating a new political culture, which is somewhat democratic. Did that ever really work? No. As long as U.S. troops were there, there was control from the still a weak central government in much of the country, and especially in the cities. But there were always areas that the Taliban had sway in. And over time, they were able to expand that. The central government really never got a lot of legitimacy in the eyes of the people. It was always corrupt. It was never seen as something that was especially effective. Certainly the security forces weren't either. And it really never was able to be something that could stand up on its own. And what we saw was when the U.S. actually pulled out, right? So there was a long process of pulling U.S. forces out. There were several thousand that remained at a couple of bases, but Trump decided that he was going to, in the first term, have direct talks with the Taliban. They came to an agreement, and then there was a deadline for the U.S. to leave, and the Taliban was not attacking U.S. troops until then. And then when the U.S. Started to leave, there was chaos. There was a very famous attack at the airport, which killed U.S., I believe it was Marines. I was actually in D.C. then, and Naftali Bennett was supposed to meet with Biden that day, and that didn't happen, so we had to stay over Shabbat. And then very quickly, the country fell city after city, province after province, and today it is back to the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, ruled by the Taliban. So those years of investment, the U.S. soldiers and the Allied soldiers that gave their lives for this, we're back to having the Taliban rule. So that is certainly seen as a quite unsuccessful example of this nation building or state building.
Let's go to a short break, and then we'll discuss Iraq and how these models can be or cannot be implemented in the Gaza Strip. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Lazar Berman. Now, Lazar, let's talk about Iraq, which seems to be a bit different of a case, especially if we look at what's happening there right now. So give us the history.
Yep. So there was this very famous period after the Afghanistan invasion where the Bush administration decided it was going to start focusing on Saddam Hussein. Of course, the U.S. had fought a war in 1991 against Saddam Hussein. There were several other operations. Saddam Hussein was a terror supporter, violating the terms of the previous ceasefire. There's no question about it. But the Bush administration very famously decided to take a very realist approach in terms of its public justification for the war, which was weapons of mass destruction, and made the argument that there was a program that needed to be stopped. And the lesson of 9/11 is you don't wait for the threat to materialize. You have to take care of it early on. It was quite controversial, but the U.S. led a rather pretty big coalition. The main ally was the UK there, Tony Blair's UK. And again, the conventional war was very, very quick. The Iraqi army was rolled over by the US. That was the shock and awe campaign, if you remember. And then some very significant mistakes were made. There was definitely people in the Bush administration who thought that the Iraqi people would welcome them as liberators, and some did. And they thought that it would be rather easy to bring democracy to Iraq. What happened was, first of all, there wasn't enough of that initial securing phase that I talked about. So looting was widespread, museums, government agencies, and there was even U.S. commanders that in later interviews, they said, I never thought that the guy carrying a sofa out of a government office was going to be my problem, right? They didn't even anticipate that they would have to they just weren't ready for it. They came to fight a pretty conventional war. Another mistake was there was the de-Baathification. So the Ba'ath Party was Saddam Hussein's, one-party rule of Iraq, and there was a pretty firm de-Baathification, which means if you were a Ba'ath Party member, so certainly the senior officials, but some lower officials as well. So in Germany, actually, a lot of Nazi Party members were allowed to run West Germany because they needed people to actually run the country and be ready to stand up a new army against the Soviet threat. That was really not done in Iraq. So they basically dismantled the Iraqi army. So there wasn't someone to maintain order. And you had hundreds of thousands of young men with guns without jobs. And they were Sunnis mostly, right? So all of a sudden, the Sunni minority, which dominated under Saddam Hussein, is all of a sudden seeing the Shia overtake them in terms of government offices and power in the country. And that fed this Sunni insurgency. And that became a very, very significant problem for the first 4 years. You get to 2006, and I believe 30,000 Iraqis died that year. You're talking really high numbers and chaos. And people were basically saying, this is a lost effort. Forget about democracy, even though there were elections. In 2007, George W. Bush makes the decision to surge in troops, so sends tens of thousands of troops in, regains control over a lot of areas, and at the same time, and it's somewhat related, there's what's called the Anbar Awakening. So it's Sunni tribal leaders in the western provinces who decided to move away from the insurgents and to throw in their lot with the U.S., and that really is a turning point there. Ultimately, U.S. troops draw down and then they leave, and over time they hand over both governance of the country and security control to Iraq and to its armed forces. Now, this government remains in place in Iraq. There is absolutely a constitution. There are elections. That same system is what governs the country. There are absolutely problems. There's no question. But Iraq is, first of all, not a country that threatens the U.S. anymore. It doesn't threaten anybody, right? There are threats that emerge from Iraq, primarily Iranian influence over parts of the country and Iranian-backed Shiite militias, but even those have been increasingly clipped and have been either absorbed into the state security services or have been limited in other ways. So in general, in Iraq, it's a mixed bag, right? It's a very qualified success in that you have a government which is one of the most democratic in the Arab world, let's be honest. It's not an autocracy. Much like Lebanon, there is this ethnic balance where you have a Kurdish president, you have a Shiite prime minister and a Sunni speaker, and a lot of different groups feel like they have a stake in the government. It's not fully sectarian, that only Shia supported, and and there's a real sense of Iraqi identity. And in recent years, there's a feeling that we don't want to be the playground for other countries. We don't want the U.S. coming in here to deal with its problems. We don't want Iran to use this as a springboard to smuggle weapons into Syria and Lebanon, or to attack Israel from. Israel's been attacked from Iraq. They don't want any of that. So in that way, it's a success. Is it a model democracy? No. Is it a model economy? No. Is there still violence? Absolutely. But this is much more successful. But the big question, going back to what we're talking about the controversy around it, forget the WMD thing, which was proven to be either a lie or mistaken. And intelligence is mistaken at times. We know that here in Israel. But the question is, why was that worth it? Or how much resources was this quasi-weak democracy worth for U.S. in terms of a massive hundreds of billions of dollars of investment and thousands of troops that were killed and many thousands more wounded? Was that worth it? Why was it worth it? So there has been a turn in the U.S. against anything that smacks of nation building. And in general, wars in the Middle East as well. And Trump himself, in both campaigns, in the 2016 campaign, and still now he talks about it. He talked about it in his May meeting in Saudi Arabia, blasting the nation builders, the neocons, all of that. Says it's not going to work in the Middle East. It's a waste of resources, of blood and treasure. And the Middle East is perfectly capable of building itself up a la UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, without outside intervention. So that's what Trump has said over the past decade.
Yeah, and I would say that for many Westerners, the idea of democracy is as potent as a religion. And it does sound like through the decades, it has been imposed on different countries, just as one would have in the past imposed Christianity or Islam. We Jews don't do that so well, I have to say. Lazar, imposing our religion on others. But in any case, at this point, it's quite possible that there is a realization that democracy is not a one-size-fit-all kind of a form of government. So let's turn to what's happening or about to happen or could maybe happen in the Gaza Strip. And I'm referencing the 20-point Trump plan, which provides for this, council of technocratic Palestinians to fill the vacuum once Hamas demilitarizes and leaves its role as rulers of the Strip. Of course, right now we're not seeing either of those things happen, neither the demilitarization nor Hamas leaving the Strip as its rulers. So, Lazar, let's talk about how this could play out in the Strip, assuming that Hamas does actually play ball.
Yeah, so first of all, is nation building even relevant to what's going on in Gaza? And I'm sure there will be arguments about it. Certainly John Spencer didn't think so. And in terms of the declaratively, that what the Trump's 20 points say, it doesn't say that. It certainly doesn't say anything about democracy. My argument is that if you add up the different components of what is starting to happen, it is certainly a long-term U.S. commitment. There's plenty of allies, but there's plenty of allies in Afghanistan and Iraq as well. It's not only the security side. So it's not only to make sure Hamas doesn't threaten the U.S. It's not only to make sure Hamas doesn't threaten Israel, but it is talking about economic development, right? And then Trump has been big on this. It's talking about education to make sure they're not being educated to hate Israel. And it's talking about civil governance. So I was in the CMCC today, the center that is overseeing the ceasefire that's based in Kiryat Gat. And there is one of the big working groups, which was having a very active meeting with dozens of people from different countries. It was entitled Civil Governance, which is talking about who's going to rule the Gaza Strip. Now, of course, you need to think about that in the short term, but the more and more this goes on, you see that there's leaks, there's articles, and if you kind of connect the dots, this is starting to sound more and more like what the U.S. has done in the Middle East, which is believing that with a long-term investment of slowly handing over security forces and governance and education and economy to the locals, that you are going to get a peaceful, prosperous society. It can work. It worked in Europe. It worked in Japan. wasn't the worst thing to happen in Iraq, right? It at least served U.S. interest. Question is, could this work in Gaza? So the first question we have to ask is Hamas going to disarm? I think there is so little chance that Hamas is going to actually disarm. They never signed anything that says they're going to disarm. They only signed the ceasefire in order to stop Israel's operation in Gaza City. And now they say in every which way that they're not going to give up their weapons. And they give these vague, if there is an arrangement within the Palestinian national consensus, it adds up to we're not going to disarm. And there's even reports now that they are trying to find ways to build up weapons caches outside of the Gaza Strip. And then when things change, to figure out a way to get them in. Classic Hamas, that they know how to, they identify the new threat to themselves, and then they are adaptable and figure out a way around it, all the time increasing the threat on Israel. So that's number one. If Hamas does not disarm, does Israel go back to war? And does the Trump administration let them? It's hard to say, but there's certainly enough indications. Israel continues to promise it will. Mike Waltz at the UN said that, or before the UN, but said this week as well. He's the U.S. ambassador to the UN, very pro-Israel guy, said that if this doesn't happen, we're not going to stop the Israel from going back to war. Let's say that Qatar and Turkey actually pressure Hamas and Hamas gets out of the way largely. Then the question is, what do the Gazans want? And this one is very sensitive, because how can you say that not everyone wants democracy and prosperity? I'm sure they would like to be prosperous. The question is, do they want Hamas to be gone? Well, you can look at polls, and there's plenty of polls that show very surprising support for Hamas. Do they want Western-style democracy? I would say that's rather unlikely. Do they want education, which is education that would be acceptable to Israel, that wouldn't see Israel as this European implant in the Middle East and these Jewish plots around the world? I'm not necessarily too optimistic on that either. Now, I will say that there are very small efforts in Israeli-controlled areas with some local clans to start this new type of education that is, nonviolent and pluralistic. It would be great if that could spread, but we know how hard this is based on Iraq and Afghanistan, and Gaza is not going to be easier than Iraq, that's for sure. Iraq is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. It has some very cosmopolitan elements, and has been a world center in the past. That is not Gaza. That is not Gazan society, which is very much more uniform, has a big refugee population, and it is quite religious also compared to Iraq. So I would say the building blocks for this to work in Gaza, they're even less sufficient or less appropriate than they were in Iraq.
So that is why I think John Spencer last week was talking about these bubbles in which certain areas, sectors could be, deprogrammed. I'm not quoting him properly, but essentially go through the process of finding security, redefining education, and having a bit of self-governance through, I suppose he meant the different, tribes in the area. But it does sound like nobody is truly optimistic, at least nobody that we've heard from is truly optimistic that Gaza in total, in sum, is going to be going through this process anytime soon.
Yeah, so there's getting to the actual process of starting it, which is going to be the issue of getting the rest of the slain hostages out and agreeing on disarmament. So that's number one. And then getting to a place where you have, it's the ink blot strategy is what he called it, where you have these small bubbles of security by the international forces where you can start to invest, rebuild education within them, and then slowly grow them. And then when people see that it is more desirable to be inside than outside, then people will move to them, show their willingness, and that way slowly take people and territory from Hamas. That seems to be the idea. That's a long-term plan. Plenty can go wrong, but that is the vision, the logic of those who want to do that model. It sounds a lot like the counterinsurgency model in Iraq after 2007, which had plenty of successes. It wasn't entirely successful, but it seems like that would be relevant in terms of the way that many of the Americans are thinking about this.
What's always surprising, I think, for many who aren't quite aware of this, but Gaza is extremely tiny. I mean, Israel itself is a small country, and Gaza is very tiny. And so this ink blot strategy to me just sounds like, what are you talking about? Like apartment building. I mean, how small are your ink blots in this situation?
So there was a Jared Kushner plan to start doing it on the Israeli side, about a kilometer by kilometer block and things like that. So there's plenty of room for kilometer and kilometer blocks. I mean, it's small on the global scale, but when you're there, it's not tiny, right? It's still, at its widest, it's 14 kilometers, and it's much longer than that as well. It has several cities in it. So, and it's packed with people, 2 million people. So there's plenty of room to do these inkblot things. And you can think how many challenges Israel faced in these very dense neighborhoods in terms of threats, in terms of tunnels and things like that. So even a few apartment blocks could be very significant. It's going to be, of course, easier on the Israeli side where there's not that many Gazans, but once you get onto the other side where Hamas currently rules, that's where there's going to be the big challenge, but that seems to be the direction things are going.
Now, you mentioned this already when you said that the Gazans are very religious, but there is this idea of suffering in order to achieve the ultimate goal, which to Hamas is, of course, to wipe Israel off the map. And so I think you alluded to this, but the overriding question is, are the Gazans more behind life and prosperity, or are they more behind this extremist ideology to get rid of Israel and that one must suffer in order to do this is just par for the course?
Yeah, there's this very strong idea of sujud, which is kind of withstanding, staying in my place and withstanding suffering and surviving and being there for the next day and continuing the fight. That's certainly a very dominant idea. Time will tell, what they want to do, if they want to take things into their own hands and get rid of Hamas, but they haven't done it until now. And support for Hamas has been is much higher than you would think. And let's not forget, Hamas didn't come from the outside. This isn't, Al-Qaeda or ISIS coming over and taking over an area. They came from Gaza. It's made up of Gazans. It's supported by Gazans. So at the very least, it has, tens of thousands of people, but the support, I fear, is much bigger than that. It'll be a question of over time if foreign efforts can move the people that are pro-Hamas to something else. That's a huge challenge. And throughout, Israel will have to keep a very close eye on what's happening, and will find ways that it maintains freedom of action so it can operate against any threats, and it won't have to sit back and once again watch a threat growing over its border.
Okay, so let's talk extremely tachlis, in practical terms, Lazar. This week, of course, the resolution proposed by the U.S. for this, security force, stabilization force, was accepted. So in terms of the very practical measures, what are we talking about in terms of timeline? From January or even before then, can we start seeing some kind of movement towards getting rid of Hamas, shall we say?
It's hard to know. I mean, the U.S. certainly wants to do this as quickly as possible. Hamas wants to play for time. They don't want to get to the disarming phase. They want to continue to deepen their hold and to basically show to everyone that they are the rulers of Gaza Strip, and there's no point in talking to anybody else. Israel says we're not going to move to any other discussions until we get the rest of the slain hostages back and get commitments on how this disarmament is going to work. Of course, they still have to build this ISF force. It's really not clear who's going to actually be there and actually make a commitment, and the specifics of how they're going to operate. All those things have to be worked out, mostly at the Kiryat Gat CMCC. I think it's going to be slower rather than quicker because we've seen how complex the first phase was, and anything that's to do with the second phase is much, much more complex.
And so in the meantime, it appears to me, and I think also to you, that we have Gaza as Afghanistan on our border.
In many ways, yes. In many ways, it's different because, again, Afghanistan was broken up into many different groups and tribes and a weak central government. Gaza has not been a place with weak central government. It's had a very strong central government. And that's been the problem. It could be that it turns into a place where it's kind of split, where there's a Hamas-Stan in the half of the country, half of the territory that it controls. And then closer around Israel's border, there's all sorts of different models. That could happen as well. So it might be a kind of a chaotic space where there's clans and Hamas and different groups. I think that's better than having a strong Hamas because, again, it was Hamas's hold and its strength that threatened Israel. Whereas if you look at other countries like Lebanon, it's Lebanon's weakness which allowed there to be a threat from Lebanon. So I think we want a weak Hamas. We certainly want a disappeared Hamas. But if it's going to survive, we are better off the weaker it is.
Lazar, thank you so much for all of this today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Lazar Focus. Please check out another episode next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or the name or anything else, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.